Welcome back to HED 241 Biostatistics and Public Health. I am Dr. Purvis. So today we're going to start part A of your textbook, the research context. So what you're going to notice is your textbook. When I'm talking about textbook, I'm talking about Making Sense of Statistics, the 7th edition. So the textbook we're using is in a workbook format so that you can read along and then you answer questions pertaining to the chapter. Okay, so there are 7 parts of the textbook. Each section is labeled as such. So the first one is part A, the research context, which is what we're going to go over. We're going to go over part of that today. We're not going over all of part A. But one thing I do want to note is make sure you follow the course syllabus. I'm talking about the Word document. Okay, it's posted on Canvas, but make sure you follow the Word document because we will definitely be skipping around some. We're not just going to go straight in order of the textbook. So make sure you follow that and not just simply the order of the textbook. Okay, so what is in part A? And this is, again, not just today's. This is the 4 sections that make up part A. So part A introduces the basic concept of empirical approach and terminologies, various types of research, and the distinction between qualitative and quantitative approaches to research. I touched on that a little bit in the What is Research video. The concept of biased and unbiased sampling methods, sampling error, what are the benefits of unbiased random sampling, along with simple random sampling. The scales of measurement, the 4 different types, what variables are. And finally, we're just going to look at the broad overview of descriptive, correlational, and inferential statistics. Okay. So the specific topics, these are the 4 sections. So this is what I refer to, this lecture is part A1. So it is the empirical approach to knowledge. So that might help you make sure you're following along correctly in your book. All right, so that's it. Chapter 1, the empirical approach to knowledge. So when we talk about empiricalism, we are referring to direct observation to obtain knowledge. The empirical approach is based on making observations of individuals or objects of interest. Okay. So it begins with a research question based on a theory or a hunch. Requires advanced planning, such as whom, how, when, and under what circumstances to observe. So with the empirical approach, you can't simply just jump in and say, this is what I'm doing, this is it. You have to actually stop and think about it, and making sure that you have a plan. So what does that plan look like? It's the empirical approach. Okay. So the first step, the researcher plans what to observe. Example, okay, the effects of public stigma and other perceived barriers on mentally ill patients. So that's what they're going to study. Okay, how teachers feel they are making a difference through teaching. That's what else they might study. So your what. Okay, researcher plans who to observe. For example, a population of mentally ill patients in a hospital ward. All public school teachers in Pennsylvania. Okay. If a population is large, the research often plans to observe only a sample. Sorry, that should say the researcher often plans to observe only a sample, a subset of the population. So when you're looking at empirical research and acquiring knowledge, most researchers are very systematic. Okay, empirical research is planned in advance. The major difference between empirical research and everyday observation is that it's planned in advance. Okay? Research questions are developed and then the researcher plans the who, how, when, and under what circumstances. Okay? And again, remember that the questions and planning are based on a theory or a hunch. Okay? So within that first empirical approach of the what and the who, I want you to think about a few things. A hypothesis. So a hypothesis is a prediction of the outcome of the research. So the researcher predicts the outcome of the research question prior to conducting the research. So the researcher is going to sit down and come up with a question that they have. So maybe you have a question about does studying impact test grades? Or what impact to study and have on test grades. Okay, so then you would come up with a hypothesis. That would be that the more you study, the better your test grades are. Okay, so you have that, and you have what you think the answers to the question is going to be prior to doing the research. So your population consists of groups of interest to one's research study. So if I use that same question, what impacts does studying have on exams, your population might be MUW students. Your sample is a subset of the population. So maybe the sample is going to be public health students. Okay? So it's a subset of that whole population. Okay. Next, the researcher plans how to observe it. By constructing measuring instruments or using an existing instrument already developed by others. Okay, so this could be something like a multiple choice test. It could be questionnaires, personality scales, anything along those lines. Online quizzes, quizzes or surveys, anything like that. Okay, so how are you going to observe it? Next, the researcher plans when the observations will be made. For example, are they going to do it, in the morning, late at night? The timing of the observation can affect the results. So if you want to ask me questions at 2 a.m., you're probably not going to get good answers because I'm asleep. If you ask me at 2 in the afternoon, you have a better chance of me actually answering and giving you a good response. Next, the researcher plans to make observations under particular circumstances. So for instance, will the observations be made in a quiet room, in a busy mall? Again, this is also things like, will you do the survey online? Will you do it in person? Will you do it online in person? Will you send out the link? Will the observations be made in the presence of a treatment, such as an experimental drug? So are you using anything like that? Okay. So here's an example of an empirical research. What factors attribute to high or low academic achievement in a particular school district? Whom? You're looking at elementary school aged children. How? Use school and district information on students' demographics and academic achievement scores. Conduct a survey for additional information not in the school database. When? You're going to conduct the survey at the end of an academic year to be compiled along with the school database. Under what circumstances? Survey questions will be distributed to be completed in class on the last week of the academic year upon the parents' consent. Okay? So it's all in the planning. Okay, but remember, not all plans are good. Just because you have a plan doesn't make it right. So it's got to follow and it's got to be right. So the best plans can still be limited by physical, ethical, legal, or financial constraints. And empirical research, it varies in quality. So just because maybe it follows this general plan, it may still not have the quality that it needs. Direct observations, such as watching adolescents in a multi-racial group interact with each other. That's direct. Okay? So there's different kinds. You can have direct or indirect. Okay? Indirect would be having adolescents respond to a questionnaire about how they would interact. Okay? So the direct is actually watching them. You're seeing them interact. The indirect is having them respond to how they interact or they would interact. Observations can yield numerical, which again is quantitative data, so numerical, quantitative, or verbal, qualitative data, according to the researcher's question. So your question decides and drives if it's quantitative or qualitative. So an example of qualitative data, ways that parents of young children are involved with their kids at home. Quantitative, scores on a scale that measure depression. Quantitative data needs to be organized and summarized through statistical analysis. Again, I mentioned in What is Research that is primarily what we're going to focus on in this course. That is not to say that qualitative is not extremely important. It doesn't have its use. It's simply that we are going to focus on quantitative more in this course. Again, I mentioned this briefly earlier, but make sure you know subjects refer to individuals being studied. So the subjects studied, okay? In recent years, the term participant is used, which implies that individuals being studied have consented to participate in the study. Okay, so once they have consented, they become participants. The term subject is still appropriate for those who did not consent. Okay, so thinking of people like that you're observing, adolescents in the shopping mall, they're subjects because they didn't have to consent because you were simply observing. Okay, animals always are subjects. The term respondent is frequently used when individuals respond to a survey. So think political poll. You know, the political polls will always say X number of respondents indicated, blah, 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 right? Okay. Examinee refers to participants who have taken an examination. So think of these as like an achievement test. A lot of times examinees are not included and even necessarily notified, but it's something that they've taken previously and agreed to prior to. That is the end of Part A, Chapter 1. Make sure you follow along on the syllabus and check your assignments on Canvas to do the correct assignment. If you have any questions, please let me know.